Hello and welcome to 25 Cents, a video game podcast. I'm Chris.
And I'm Nick. Each ad hoc episode will be talking about something in games that has caught our interest with a focus on games that are great to play if you've got kids.
And you can find us wherever you listen to podcasts or on the web at 25c.goodstuff.network. Jingle, jingle, jingle. Hey, Nick, welcome back. Do
you remember welcome back, Chris. This? It has been a long time.
Yeah, it was actually a year ago, almost. April 2nd, 2022, that we recorded episode 49, so episode 50 we're back with. We've kind of just decided that, well, we haven't decided. Fate, work, life, etc. has decided that this is going to be a show that we record when we have something to talk about. Not a weekly, bi-weekly, whatever, frequency podcast.
I think we had some success with bi-weekly there, but it turned out we were just kind of repeating whatever was on, the Nintendo YouTube channel or Polygon.com or something, so... We're not that kind of show. I think it's more we like to chat about, what we're playing, what our kids are playing.
Yeah, so apologies to our legions of listeners that cried out in pain when each month went by and no episode came. But at least you have this one, all 10 of you. So the reason for this episode is... obviously, but you can tell by the title, I'm assuming, if I named it correctly when we released this, that we're here gathering today to talk about the Playdate, which is a handheld gaming system with a crank. That's how I've described it to my kids because they keep thinking, like, when I talk about it, I've been trying to get them interested in it, just seeing if they're interested, and they're like, it looks dumb, it looks old, and it has a crank. Anyways, they're interested in it, but it's, So Nick has one, I don't. He held it up for the video viewers if we release a video.
Yes, so I can do a little pretend unboxing here. I still have kept the box in my drawer of electronics goodies for some reason.
Yeah.
But, it has this very whimsical box experience. The box is about the size of a Switch, and inside you find this tiny little yellow square device. And, I think the crank really stands out, right? That it's a small but high resolution screen, and then the crank docked on the side, and then just your two little A and B buttons and a D-pad, plus the power menu button.
So if you're living under a video game rock and maybe not sure about what this is obviously not something from Microsoft, from Sony, from Nintendo, the big three, not even from Steam, which that's a whole other handheld era or device situation that we could talk about someday. But Panic, who makes an FTP file uploader for Mac, is the company that actually produces and makes and designs the Playdate. And the reason for this conversation, the urgency, I guess you could say, is that they've decided they're going to raise the price on the Playdate, which I feel like is fair pricing. We can get into that, whether the pricing is fair or not. But end of March here, they're going to raise the pricing because of supply issues and the global pandemic and all the other things we should all be very familiar with by now. So we're just kind of talking about whether Chris should, with 11 days on the calendar, pre-order one or not. And that's kind of like Nick's job, is to convince me as the unofficial Panic spokesperson.
I've got the Panic sales job today. I'm not sure who at Panic has that job normally, but I'm taking over for one individual potential customer at any rate.
We should mention that it's Krista Mergen, right, that hosts. There's a fantastic Panic podcast where they talked about the making of the Playdate, and now obviously are marketing it and talking about the process of game making and all that kind of stuff around it. So we'll link to that in the show notes as well, which is definitely worth listening to. It's very well produced, not just like a quick one-off random conversations, but actually a produced podcast, unlike maybe this one. But anyways, and so just in brief, Panic, like I said, who makes Panic? No, who makes the Playdate is Panic. They're known as a software editor maker for Mac, but then they've also published, not made, but published video games like Firewatch, Untitled Goose Game. So I've played both of those great games, and so it's kind of like a whimsical, fun company that also happens to do like sort of utilitarian software for the Mac in a fun way as well. So, in terms of what is the Playdate, we've talked about it a bit. Obviously, you've held it up for the video viewers, but like someone visits play.date, and what do they see?
So I think for people, kind of around our age or between our relative ages, roughly, I think the easiest thing to evoke is probably the original Game Boy in a lot of ways, right? It's black and white pixel art, a small handheld. But there's a lot of things that are different about it, right? It's using modern technology, the display technology, which I think they go into in one of the early Playdate podcast episodes. I forget the name of it, but it's basically a very high resolution LCD technology. So you get these really crisp pixel art graphics, almost the sort of retina density that we might talk about on modern phones, but black and white. The size of it, and you can really see if you're on video, the way it fits into the palm of my hand is quite small. It's almost too small for my adult hands, but that actually makes it great for my 9-year-old who has played it some. So I feel like the original Game Boy is the easiest thing to connect to, but it's got Wi-Fi. All of the games are loaded over the air. And the thing that excited me the most about it was some of the stuff they were talking about even before pre-orders were available back in 2021 was their development platform, right? That they were going to have both a full SDK for like serious game developers, but also a kind of lighter weight web-based one called Pulp. And I was interested in that both for my own, how I'm a software developer by trade, but not a game developer. And so I was interested in it, kind of like, what could I play around with? And knowing that there was a more accessible version of development available for it, that it would be potentially something that could be a fun kid project. And I can talk about that a little bit more later. But in terms of the games themselves, right, so the way they started off was a season. So, as soon as you opened up your Playdate, you would get you would start season 1. And they had prearranged with a couple of many different indie developers, some that are kind of known, famous, at least within kind of Apple indie circles, right? Like Zach Gage, for example, did 1 or 2, I think, and some other names as well that you'd probably recognize. And they would come delivered to your Playdate over time, a couple a week, I think it was at first. And then, so what I found was, and we can kind of get into the why should you buy a Playdate one, right? Is I actually was not picking it up and playing as often as I expected to after I got it. And I think the main reason is maybe related to why, we haven't been recording as much, or just my general game times. I've definitely been busier. I think we're very much in a peak TV season of late, and so some of my entertainment time is going to like watching things together as a family, or just me and my wife watching things, right? So there's less that. And then I think one of the biggest limitations is you cannot play it in a dark room. It does not have a backlight.
Oh, interesting.
So I think that is, for me, there's not, like, I can't squeeze in a quick game, in the dark. And I'm not commuting
Which
for a few
sounds a
more
little
months.
creepy the way you said that.
Oh, you're right. No, I don't know, like before
Like,
bed.
I totally get it.
Right?
Yeah.
Because
just
and
for
the
an
games
example,
are very digestible.
In terms of like someone, when you say like in the dark, so like a reading light at your bedside, is that bright enough to, like, if you're reading a book, could you play the Playdate,
Yeah.
or is it more like it needs to be super bright?
Yeah, so it's more that you can't use it like, you're using your phone in bed before it falls on your face kind of thing, right? Like, because it doesn't have a backlight.
Okay.
But yeah, with a small reading light or lamp, you can definitely use it for that. But thinking in terms of, when would I play like small amounts of games, it might be, to kind of wind down before bed. Mm-hmm. In terms of the games you can play on it, though, there are some really fun concepts, some of which use the crank in really clever ways as a control mechanism. Because obviously, like I said, it's like the Game Boy. Sure, that's true for the buttons and D-pad, but the crank adds an interesting element, and some of the games have really explored that. So let's see, what was this one called? I'm trying to remember some of the game names.
Just before you go too far into games, just curious how, like, so you mentioned the season, and
yes.
But then I also look at like Playdate games, like play.date/games, and there's games that have a price, like $15 for Playmaker or whatever.
Right.
And so obviously are they pivoted away from the season thing, or it's both? Or you can do the season if you want, but you can also buy the games separately?
So I believe the season, everyone who buys a Playdate does still get access to season 1. And then now they have the Playdate catalog, which is more like, an app store. You can use it on device. And then the other one that I've done some use with is if you have a Playdate developer account set up, you can go on like I found some on itch.io. And a developer can build a little Playdate binary and distribute it for free on itch. And then you can go grab it into. It was a little harder in the past. You could sideload it into your Playdate developer account, and then it would be available on your device over Wi-Fi. Nice. So that's how I got like a little. There was like a little basic solitaire game, a little basic Tetris game that weren't a part of the season. They weren't part of the new catalog, but they were some things to try. And those tend to. I think some of those itch releases tend to be a little bit rougher in terms of design. Compared to what was in the season. It was more like, hey, I'm going to throw together this cool idea. But some of them have been pretty fun. In terms of what's currently in the catalog that I've tried, we could dive into that more. But yeah, so I think Panic maybe, is kind of experimenting with what kind of model is going to work. I think they are very much trying to avoid some of the things that we know and maybe hate from the app stores in terms of, free-to-play models and subscription pricing, within an app and these other things. And I think they're helped by some of the constraints, and maybe that's a thing we could talk about, right? Which is, like I said, the screen is small. It's only black and white. One of the goals is for the games to be fairly small and digestible experiences. You kind of, again, thinking about like, what might fit on a Game Boy cartridge. Obviously, you can do way richer graphics now with this device than you could on an original Game Boy. But I think those constraints kind of driving developers to, kind of come up with and experiment with some models that maybe wouldn't be possible just doing an indie app on iOS. And I think to what you said earlier about, kind of the community or reputation that Panic has in the sort of independent Apple developer space is, I think the kinds of people who have a Playdate at this point are that tier of game player who are the ones who would drop $5 to $10 on an iOS game without really even thinking about it if it's from a developer they love, right? Yeah. And so I think maybe that's kind of where we'll see things shake out, is that the audience is this, more focused instead of general audience on, I really want this kind of game experience. I really want to pay and support game developers, especially independent developers. So I think that's what I've experienced so far with it. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's where like the experience looks like. I just actually a few comments just in terms of what I've seen in not having one, but just obviously observing and hearing and reading about it and stuff. Is I hadn't realized up until this latest, I don't know, whatever that was, some sort of update happened. Maybe it's just because of the new game catalog, and then a bunch of people did reviews on it recently. I saw like sort of hardware reviews, or maybe people were just talking about it. Like Jason Snell had a video sort of review, and then Gruber actually did a bit of a one on Daring Fireball, or maybe he just linked to them. Anyways, the thing that I hadn't really realized, even though there's obvious like press images of the Playdate on the website, how small it actually is, and you referenced this earlier, but like it wasn't until I saw, I think it was Jason Snell or Gruber, I forget who it was, but they had it in their hand with their iPhone next to it, and yeah, like you said, it looked almost too small to be enjoyable. Maybe it's like old man eyes impacting me now or whatever, and worrying about some of that kind of stuff, but and then also just having big hands, I guess, and trying to like fiddle around with this small device in my hand. But by the same token, I think, like you said, having the accessibility of it being small so that it fits easily to carry with you wherever you happen to go, or also be accessible for kids, little smaller hands, in a way that, like, obviously, like a game, my youngest is, Xbox controller is still a big sort of unwieldy kind of device almost in her hands at age 10. And so that definitely is appealing. One thing just in terms of like, since you brought it up, that I like playing it in bed before you go to sleep or whatever, sound wise, can you use headphones with it, or what's the sound quality like, I guess, and how does that sort of impact the usability of it?
Yeah, so I'm not actually sure. I've tried it with headphones. The sound quality, is very much in that kind of chiptune
Right.
area. It's not like a full speaker. It's like it's like programming for the old sound chips on older devices, where there's a couple of tracks, basically MIDI tracks that you can do with a couple different tone generators, triangle wave, square wave, that kind of thing. And within that constraint, people are able to make some really cool sounding like chiptune songs, playing as a music bed under the game. And a lot of those kind of classic, sound effects you might expect for like, oh, this is what happens when something blows up. I don't think I have a good way to capture sound from the device.
Okay.
But thinking of
like that is a headphone jack on the bottom, right? Is that what I'm seeing?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and then the speaker on the side, obviously too, which is it's fun looking.
It
device.
sounds great. It's fun. Yeah.
Yeah.
And like you said, the width of it's about the width of a non-plus iPhone of current generation, or non-Max. I don't know, Pro Max.
One of the
whatever
regular,
they're called
non-mini,
now.
non-Max.
Yeah, so it's about the width of a current generation iPhone. So yeah, I guess I haven't played like a super long session where I'm like starting to regret my hands cramping up, but
Right.
It does slide with the cover like right into a back jeans pocket. I kind of think it might be part of my commuting routine when kind of return to office for me comes up in a couple months here. Even if I'm not going in every day, I would have a bus ride, drop my kid at school, bus downtown, and that would be a good time to fit in, again, some sort of smaller snackable game experiences that they have.
You referenced the cover. It's not sold with one. You can buy one for like a bundle price or buy it separately after the fact, but worth getting the cover, I would assume, just for protecting it.
Yeah, I like the cover. I'm holding it up. It's a little, nice feeling. I guess it's some kind of vinyl plastic, and it's got these little pins, magnetic pins, to hold it in place on the back. So most of the time, I just keep the cover on the device. When playing, I guess if you're playing a certain more intense game, the way it kind of flips back, you might want to just take the cover off completely. But most of the time, I've left the cover on. It does add a bit to the weight of the device because it's otherwise a very small, lightweight device. But yeah, the cover and the sort of the purple yellow combination go together nicely. It's not quite lemon colored for branding purposes, but it's close.
It's close enough I could probably write it off as a business expense.
Yeah.
As the charging it, like USB-C charging looks like, and so a USB port on a computer or brick or whatever. But as far as charging and battery time, what have you noticed there?
Yeah, so alluding to the fact that there were some longer breaks I had where I wasn't using it very often, I did have a brief moment of panic where I realized that I hadn't plugged it in for a long time and it would not come on even while plugged in. But then I read some things online and it's like if it's been pretty discharged for a while, you need to give it like an hour or two of charging before you can even turn it on. So I think that's just how their power chip happens to work. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I would say most of the time it seems like I've gotten several hours of gameplay between charges. I haven't noticed if like doing a bunch of heavy Wi-Fi downloads or game installs kind of costs more. I think I've generally plugged it in for doing system updates, although there haven't been a huge number of those. So yeah, definitely a pretty good charge, and it charges to full pretty quickly on I mostly just plug it into the small, older iPhone USB brick, and that works well.
Yeah. So here, just like a bit of maybe, I don't know if we're wrapping up or if this is just a tangent to run down that I'm just realizing as we're talking is for parents considering a device such as this, I can just envision, we just went on a bit of a day trip, 2-hour drive there, 2-hour drive back kind of thing. And we wanted to, with intentionality, not bring devices with a screen, not so much because we didn't want to distract our kids, but we're just taking a break. And so, but the big part of that is actually more, not so much about not having a game along to play, which they could do on the phone, but the internet access that comes with a phone, a device of some sort generally. And that's kind of what appeals to me a bit about something like this in a similar way that the Switch offers. I think if you have a Switch, this would be very similar, I think. But a gaming device that isn't also a browser, doesn't also have Instagram Reels and Snapchat, doesn't connect them to the outside world in any sort of meaningful way, either your kids or yourself for that matter. And to bring that along as a sort of focused, like a gaming device, I think is one way to sort of think of this thing, this device, in your sort of library of gaming devices that you might consider, because it is it's 200 it's going to be 200 US or more. I forget which price I'm looking at here, but so it's not cheap. It's not like a $50 portable or throwaway device almost or whatever at some point, but it's 179 US right now, but then it's going up I think to 200 US I believe is the difference. So it's something you want to think about, obviously, that you're going to use and make use of. But I think it does sort of sit well in that like retro look, but also a bit more intentionality to the gaming, but also not being like super. Like there's nothing like a must-have game yet, right? In your mind, at least, where it's like, if I want to play Zelda, I have to have the Switch, or like whatever game might be, sort of marquee game that has grabbed people. At least nothing I've seen or noticed people talking about, like, oh my gosh, you have to buy a Playdate because of X, which really
I don't think there's really a single game exclusive, right? There's not. There are some like Tetris clones, but there's not like the Tetris for the original Game Boy, which made that device. That device plus that game as an exclusive at the time.
For my kids' purposes, there's no
biopic coming that I'm really excited. It looks pretty good.
Yeah, that'll be a fun one. Fortnite is not playable on the Playdate, is what I was going to ask you, just to confirm.
Yeah, it's 2D pixel art. And actually, I think thinking about the game exposure that my kid has, it's mostly been largely 3D games on iOS, the iPad, family iPad, or the Switch, and so his only real exposure to 2D pixel art has been, I guess, maybe the Switch Online, the retro console emulators that are on the Switch as part of Nintendo Online. So he's played like original Tetris there, looked at the SNES Zelda there, for example. But yeah, I think, like you said, it's that focused experience. It's not the abstract black slate that can do everything like a modern smartphone. It's very much this one thing. It has tactile controls, which, if you've listened to like John Siracusa on Accidental Tech podcast over the years, is a big plus. Touch has a lot of advantages, but for certain things, but especially for games, I think most people would say, hey, an actual physical button that you push is neat. And with the crank, I've seen some fun games. Like there's one that has a time travel mechanic where you're running and jumping, but then you can crank backwards to kind of dodge things, or crank forwards to kind of dodge things, depending on where you are. And so that's like a clever use of that physical control, one that you don't find on
any other.
I don't know. Was there? It's not really any of the Guitar Hero, Rock Band things had a crank in their physical control library.
Yeah, that is, I guess, one thing. Like, is that a gimmick that hasn't played out in terms of being used by game developers, or is it? Not obviously, not every game is going to have a reason to have a crank mechanic, but is it kind of like limited to one kind of style of game, or has it been used, in neat ways by other devs that you've seen?
Yeah, I've seen it used in color ways. There's one game, I'm forgetting the name of it, but it's kind of Asteroids-like. But instead of more traditional Asteroids where you would turn with the D-pad or arrow keys on a computer, if you're playing that version, you turn with the crank and then just thrust. So it adds an interesting challenge, because it's like muscle memory wise, it doesn't quite map the way you usually would control such a game. So I think, going back to what you said about, there's no single exclusive game, but you're kind of buying into the experience. And I think, like I was saying, the kinds of people who are interested in a platform like the Playdate are the kinds of people who want, kind of experimental interfaces. One that I really liked is, so some of the games just use it for menu selection, but there's a game that's out in the catalog called Recommendation Dog. So you're like a temp agency, and you have a Rolodex. And so you use the crank to flip through the Rolodex, and it's just a very nice, physical analog for the analog thing that doesn't really exist anymore, for practical purposes, right? So I think I keep seeing developers being pretty clever with these things, even if it's not every single game is doing something gimmicky with the crank.
Yeah, yeah. And that's where, like, looking at even something like one of the top games, not top in terms of ranking, but just on the webpage, happens to be a game called Carve Jr., which looks like it's a snowboarding game, right? And selling for $8. But it looks just like something about the screenshots, even there's no video, demo or whatever, but looks like a thing that would be just fun to play, like you said, while you're on the bus or on a trip or whatever, but isn't like a thing where you have to obviously remember where you are in the storyline or anything like that. And I think some of the games, when I look at them, when I think about even with my kids, and we can talk about what we're playing these days, but anything whether it's because of attention timelines or whatever being down for kids, or it's just the nature of my kids, or it's whatever the world is, but like a lot of like text on screen reading, I find them skipping stuff in games where I'm like, hey, we have to read this to see what happens next, or why we're doing this thing next, or whatever. They just want to get to the action or whatever. And so if a lot of the games do tend to have a bit more of, because of obviously it's not like they can have a video scene. It's text on screen explaining the story or whatever and stuff like that. And so, I wonder. It'd be interesting to sort of throw this in front of my kids and see how they react to it. Some of them have been going through like this. Anything retro looking is bad because it just is old, right? And like if we have to watch a video that's like in obviously whatever DVD resolution was, 480p or whatever that was, then they're like, oh, this show looks awful, or like all these comments start flying. Even if the show is really amazing, it's like, no, but you need to watch, or whatever. Kind of just like rebelling against whatever your parents like or something is probably a play there as well. And so that's where some of this kind of feels like it'll get relegated to a drawer if I'm the only one playing it, just because of the Xbox or the Switch or whatever already being, looking and feeling newer and better. And so maybe it's when they're ready to investigate.
And that's where I wonder if the making your own games, right, is something that they would be interested in, right? Because Pulp it's somewhere, on the spectrum between like, a Mario Maker where you're entirely within another game, playing with their toolbox, and a fully open-ended game. And again, the constraints of both the platform and Pulp make it kind of more accessible, right? Like, so last summer, I did a little mini game dev camp with my son and my niece, and they made some tiny little like tile adventure games, because it makes it pretty easy to just kind of draw what you want and have the character sprites move around and pop up some little text story when you hit a certain block. Pretty accessible for 8-9-year-old to make their own little story in ways that I think to me are reminiscent of like me playing around with HyperCard on a Mac in like middle school, where you can kind of string together some basic things and some button events, and so I guess in that way it's more like maybe MIT Scratch, like one of these kid oriented development programs, but it's not exclusively for kids. It definitely has limitations compared to the full SDK. Like, you're not doing full pixel art. It's very much geared towards kind of top down, moving around a game world type adventures. But you can do some pretty neat stuff within that, and make your own music and make your own sprites. And I could see that really being appealing, especially if you had friends also on the platform where you're like, hey, I made this game. Here's my Playdate file. Why don't you put it on yours, and then you can play it. You can't just easily develop a game for Xbox, right? The entry, the barrier to entry is a little different.
Yeah, that's where actually it's interesting. Fortnite has obviously still got a huge hold on our kids. Actually, not as much as it used to, but I noticed they just announced Fortnite Studio. I forget what they're calling it, but anyways, their own like world game developer thing as a separate app, I think, rather than trying to do stuff in game. You can develop worlds and in the creative mode or whatever. And Fortnite, and it seems like there's a lot of, like, obviously lots of games have world building tools now out for them, even the bigger games or whatever like that, to allow for customization and keep people, eyeballs on the game, obviously, the longer they can. And so it is like an interesting space and time to be able to do that still. Because I remember that too for, I think it was Doom or whatever, one of the games way back in the day that I realized, you can actually I could try and redesign my house inside of Doom or whatever it was in the development side of it. And it just brings to mind a friend of mine, Dave Rupert, who is walking through this sort of a blog of game development with his kid who wants to make a video game together. Obviously, Dave being a programmer, and he can do all that stuff, and then his kid's kind of just being the product manager for the game.
Right.
And similar, but on like a Game Boy emulator, but similar idea as to what is going on here. So just in terms of like but walking through it with him with his kid as far as like how this will all work, and almost like a programming, what's the word I'm looking for? Cosplaying as programmers together to walk through it and give an example of like constraints and what we can do and what we can't do and what was realistic for now and what we could actually do if we spent more time on it and things like that. So anyways, all that to say, very cool. And that part definitely is appealing too, like just having access to the device in a way that you don't really for even iOS or whatever, obviously, where you can't just easily throw a game into the App Store by any means.
Right.
So,
I mean, you can technically use Pulp and their little like web player to more or less play the game just online. But it's definitely, you get more of the experience if you can download it to the actual device. But yeah, I think, there's if any of your kids are showing some interest in programming, right? Like the basics with Pulp and Pulp script, it'll kind of introduce you to conditionals and loops and, how to use global variables and some of those basic concepts of programming where you might not even realize you're programming because you're setting up a game. But if you're interested in exposing them to that kind of creative aspect,
and even I wonder too sorry, I was going to say, just with the SDK, you get the simulator for local development, right? So you can actually see the device, even if you don't have one, I guess technically, right? You could probably use a simulator.
I imagine there are some of these game developers that maybe had certainly on Itch, right, where like because of the constraints on getting in the first tier of orders when they were first coming in late 2021 into 2022, you probably were making games without the physical device yet.
Yeah. So, anyways, that's all beside the point, I guess. But it is like there's lots of options there for beginner to intermediate to obviously very advanced gaming development on this platform, which is kind of fun. But still having that constraint of graphics and sound that isn't going to mean the entire world, like opening up Unity or whatever for a modern game dev and trying to rebuild Fortnite or whatever, obviously is a little bit more difficult. So, the little games that the kids made this past summer, I think they're 30K compiled, right? Like for a couple of little screens and some sprites and some sounds. Like that's just a different era. Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, I think, any final comments on the Playdate before we wrap up?
I really like it. I want to play it more. I think there's a number of games that I would really enjoy. And I'm looking forward to seeing if my kid kind of continues to express interest in making his own games for it as probably a project that'll return this summer after the school year is over. Yeah.
Yeah, I think for me, there's definitely... I like the device. Hardware-wise, it looks really fun. The games look fun and interesting just in a either quick or just like a game that you can pick up and just play randomly and not have to dive into forever for hours of gameplay necessarily. And the only, like you just said, like I want to play more. That's like the thing that holds me back from dropping the 200 Canadian or whatever it would be up here is I already have games on my phone, games on my Switch, and games on my Xbox that I want to play more but don't. And so is this going to be the device that cures me of that ill? Probably not. 'Cause it's obviously a me issue, not the game.
Right.
And so that's the part that kind of holds me back. But it is kind of a fun thing to like have as a family device. And maybe we can switch into like what we are playing these days, because in a similar but very different world, my one son had birthday money burning a hole in his pocket and convinced that the Meta Quest 2, which is formerly known as the Oculus, we keep calling it the Oculus because that's what it was branded as. But anyways, Facebook bought Meta, or is Meta now, and bought Oculus. Now they call it the Quest. So VR device, obviously not a similar kind of thing in terms of like quality of or capabilities of a game, but a very different gaming experience. And it has like taken a bit of a hold for him and his friends. He's in late elementary school age, and in his mind beforehand was like, every kid has a Quest and I should have a Quest. And we were like, no, they don't. And then he connects online with his friends to play games in Quest, and turns out a lot of them do. There is quite a few of his friends from school that have Quests. And so we'll spend another episode talking about, whether it's good or not. But anyways, it's just an interesting way of like I was kind of worried about adding yet another device to our library of video gaming consoles, or whatever you want to call them all, in our home. And at least for him, and it's very early days, like a few weeks in, he's definitely spending hours, if we let him, playing in there with a very rudimentary game called, the main one he plays is called Gorilla Tag, where you're legless gorillas running around a very what's the word? Not pixely, but VR looking world,
right,
where the trees are kind of just like poorly matted trees, and like it doesn't look at all realistic.
Yeah, it looks like old like Virtua Fighter or Spectre VR era kind of graphics or something. Yeah. Yeah.
And it's not like I guess my point being, just like the Playdate, the graphics, the sound quality even are not holding him back from playing it. It's the experience of getting to do it, obviously, with friends, and just the VR experience in general is like so fun to him. And he comes away like physically, it's like a workout, because he comes away like sweating from playing this thing and moving his arms around, his feet, like way more interactive than any Switch. Like I've seen him spend hours on Fortnite with his neck down looking at a Switch, and I'm sure there's going to be other neck injuries that potentially happen with VR-based devices, but definitely not. It's at least different ones, maybe, than the Switch. So, anyways, it's just interesting comparing those two devices. Very different, obviously, devices, but just the idea of like low poly, low graphics, all that stuff is not inhibiting gameplay in any means for the Quest. So.
Right. Not everything has to be, AAA, the latest Call of Duty or Assassin's Creed or whatever top tier graphics game. Yeah. Yeah.
And even them, like last night, the two boys were playing, it's like Dead Space Pirates or something, but it has nothing to do with, I don't know why it's called that, because it's just, you're standing on a platform shooting things coming at you from space, basically. And you have different gun types and a shield, and you can move around and, block and things. And it's fun. There's no denying it. It's fun. It's not like, anyways, what's being played in your house these days, if you have a chance to play?
Yeah, well, so definitely playing a little bit less. I think, like I said, some TV, and actually reading again is more, a leisure activity we're doing a little bit more of. We've been binging the Murderbot Diaries sci-fi novella series.
That's really good.
Which is really good.
Yeah.
But I think mostly have not been using arcade as much. We still have it as part of the one bundle, but the stuff coming out lately, I think, has been more kind of remasters of older iOS games than the stuff that first came out on arcade, which I feel like is kind of the little indie creative games that I'm seeing of a type on Playdate. So we've been playing more Switch. I picked up Lego Star Wars, the updated all 9 movies edition, and have been playing that. Although, as we discovered, my wife cannot be in the room when that's on the TV because something about the engine gives her like instant motion sickness. If she's watching us play for some reason, something about the Lego game.
Yeah.
And then we did get Minecraft for Switch for my son's birthday a bit ago, and he and his best friend at school, actually, we got them set up where they can both go online to not like a full Minecraft realm, but the like shared user version where they can like add to each other's houses and stuff. And so that's been kind of fun to see them iterate on that. We did a combination of Christmas money and allowance money for Pokemon Scarlet and Mario Party around Christmas. Mario Party is pretty fun, just as a family game, the three of us. And I remember playing or trying to convince my friends who had Nintendo 64. It's like, oh yeah, let's play Mario Party. It's like a board game, but a video game. Isn't that cool? And they're like, yeah, I got it, I guess. So that was not an easy one. It was much more like GoldenEye at parties. Pokemon Scarlet is interesting because I think my kid is really into Pokemon as an idea, and he really likes the idea of the game. But I think open world RPG is like a little bit too easy for him to get stuck or not to be sure what to do next yet at age 9. So I think that's one where probably need to sit down and kind of play it together a little bit more. At the same time, during the school year, not as much time to play a big game like that for him.
I wonder if part of it, like a 9-year-old might not be able to identify this, but it took me a while to realize in open world RPG kind of games is, and maybe it's a consequence of adulthood and mortgages and other pressures of life, but like the open worldness sometimes works against me, where I'm just too stressed that I'm missing out on something that before I move on that I'm going to forget and have to come back and do it. Almost like, am I going to forget to check the tire pressure before we go on this road trip kind of vibe,
right?
Of adulthood. But yeah,
I mean, as someone who played World of Warcraft like it was a second job for a while, now over 10 years ago, you're just like, oh, do I have all my materials? Do I, have I packed everything I need? Have I trained? Have I practiced? Right? Like, it's a very different game experience, and some of the open world RPGs I think get into that. But yeah, I mean, he likes the feel of it, but I think the actual gameplay maybe just hasn't clicked yet. So we'll see. Maybe this summer there might be a little more game time.
Did you
I think in general, just schoolwork and reading and stuff are kind of dominating.
Did you ever do Breath of the Wild? You haven't ever taken the plunge, right?
No.
Yeah. That's probably good to wait on that one.
There was a sale, I think, recently
Mario
of
Day.
the previous game in preparation for the second one coming out. And I was a little tempted, but I just realized, again, like you were saying earlier, right, like the idea of sitting down and having a potentially dozens or even 100 hours of story ahead of me is daunting. So it's hard to imagine, kind of picking up a game like that.
Yeah. Cool. I wish the Switch. I picked up a cheap handheld control. Not cheap, like it's actually the Nintendo authorized one, but it was like a Costco returns thing or whatever, for like $25 for the handheld, but the plug-in controller for the Switch. Thinking I would use that for Breath of the Wild play, because I think I'd like just having a handheld, but a better controller for it. But I hadn't realized when I bought it that the Switch doesn't allow you to plug the controller in without the dock, which in hindsight makes sense. I understand like what a USB port on the Switch itself would take up space and is difficult to do. But just in my head, I was like, oh, I'll just plug this in. Then wherever I am, I can just set it down, plug in, and play with the controller and not have to hold the device while I'm playing or whatever. I think that just doesn't work well with my brain or my eyes or whatever. But yeah, so now I'm like, oh, well, I guess if I want to bring it up to my office and play or whatever with that controller, then I need to get another dock, and then it's just, anyways. I should have just bought the wireless one, I guess, is the answer. It's probably, but it was $60 instead of $25, so I was like, right, sweet. But I'll end up spending more money on another dock or something.
Yeah, I actually, our original Switch Pro controller, which is like the main one that like my wife prefers for Mario Kart, among other games, one of the buttons is starting to be a little flaky, so I think I'm actually going to try to tackle it with my like electronics iFixit type kit and see if I can get in there and just dislodge whatever's in there.
That's what my son's...
a replacement wireless controller is, like you said, like $60, but I think I should be able to unscrew a few things and reset everything okay.
Yeah. My son did that with he had a custom color Xbox controller that he bought a few years ago, and it has joystick drift or whatever. But he ended up finding a guy who was going to sell him the part for it locally here. But then the guy was like, well, for an extra $5, I'll just fix it for you. And so we went to some guy's house basement, whatever, dropped off his controller, picked it up a couple days later. It was like $5 or $10 or whatever, and then now it's fixed. And but yeah, then it does seem to be the the nature of video game controllers these days. Back in the day, it was like you just blow on it and it kind of works again for a while, or else you throw it out because they're not that expensive. But these days, controllers are so expensive compared to, it feels like anyways, but that's a whole other conversation too. So I've been diving into a most bizarre one that I never would have thought I would have is Castle Crumble on Apple Arcade, which is like, I think you referenced your kid had tried it once or twice.
Yeah.
And I'm thoroughly smoking you on Game Center points or whatever. But but it's like the most mundane, like it's silly, like just launching cannonballs at a castle to make it crumble, just like the title says. And but it's like just that perfect mindless, like a video is exporting and I just need something to play for a bit, or I want to just distract and not like do work. That's kind of as much as it is, and it's like it looks nice. It's fun. The sounds are fun. There's different, obviously, cannonball mechanics and stuff, but it's by no means very innovative or interesting in terms of gameplay style or what it brings to a gaming system. But because it's on Apple Arcade, I bought it, and I know that I don't have to worry. It's the total type of game that would have like in-game purchases if it was sold separately. But I like, again, with Apple Arcade, like we've said many times, knowing that I can just buy this or play this, and not have to deal with that. The other one, actually, the game that we've picked up and started playing on Game Pass, but I actually, in hindsight, I wish I would have just bought it, is It Takes Two, which I think is on multiple platforms, which it's I want to say almost like a divorce simulator. It's kind of, or something like, it's basically like a marriage therapy game, but which makes it sound horrible, or not horrible, but like just not for something you play as a family, but like
not entertainment maybe.
Yeah, but the game, when it's built around the idea that these two parents and their daughter, they're fighting and they're planning to have a divorce, and then she orders this book to like for her parents to like get them back together, and the whole game is basically you having to work together, but you're in like these avatars, these like little toy versions of the parents running through the house in giant scale, obviously, and you're tiny, and having to like complete various quests and boss battles and things like that. And it's like it clicked halfway through that, or I don't even know if we're halfway through, but how much gameplay there actually is. Like I have no idea how close we are, but like we just entered a world, and it was like you have now gone one of 4 things that within this subsection of the game, and thinking that we were actually getting close to the end of the game. And so yeah, there's just a ton of gameplay, a ton of like stuff where you have to do one thing and your partner has to do the other thing to help you get it. Like we have magnets right now attached to our backs, and one is positive, one is negative, so we can do different things within the game where one has to do pull and the other one has to push the thing, and just giant worlds that you're running around in. And so there's an element of, I guess, for parents, obviously, if that hits too close to home, because there is dialogue within the game about like how a couple and relationships, need to like work together, and there's some positive messaging there. But also, if you or someone near you is going through struggles, there's going to be awkward conversations that happen,
right?
Potentially with your kids, because they're like they hear the words about divorce in the game, and there's some like mild ass and I forget damn words that are used. There's adult language within the sort of cutscenes, but then the game itself is very much like fun for kids. So it's a weird. I don't know. I had heard about it for a few years beforehand, and then because it's on Game Pass, we just tried it out, and yeah, my youngest actually loves playing it together, and and like the title, It Takes Two, it's great with 2 people, and you can play it remotely too. Like your friend can download the free, at least on Xbox. I'm sure it's similar on other platforms. Your friend can download the free client almost, and then you can pair up over whatever online service to play together. Even if
they can join your game.
Yeah. So lots of fun, and worth checking out if you haven't ever done it. And it should be fairly cheap now if it's not on Game Pass that you're looking up. So, anyways. That's sort of, and then my one other kid is suddenly dove big into Rocket League as the game that he has to play all the time for some reason, and is semi-determined to make it as a Rocket League professional gamer. So we'll see where that goes and what it's up. Trying to balance like expectations with reality and somewhere in between. But trying to. We haven't like bought him a gaming chair or anything like that to make sure he has the optimum experience for Rocket League's goals, but. Yeah.
Do you have the gaming lights that you need?
No, he's toyed with the idea of streaming and stuff with it, because like these days you can pick up a cheaper Xbox S and then like a cheaper computer, and then you've got a pretty good streaming rig. And obviously I have gear coming out the wazoo for cameras and mics and stuff, and so, but primarily right now playing it. But I could see him getting into shouting at the computer for entertainment value for someone else watching, I guess, maybe someday.
Yeah.
So we'll see. But all right, well, we went a little longer than I thought we were going to, just to talk about quick Playdate. That's what's the fun and struggle of recording a podcast, and this is probably why we don't do this weekly or bi-weekly. But thank you all for listening. Let us know. I don't know how to reference Mastodon link accounts these days, but it's a jumble of words. That's where I'm on Mastodon these days. I'm not checking Twitter anymore because I noticed on our sign-off we have, like, find us on Twitter. But at any rate, I'm on Mastodon at iChris on Mastodon Social, and you can find us there. And how about you?
I'm at UltraNerd at TacoBellLabs.net. It's a friend's instance, so it's a fun one. I do technically still have my Twitter account, but I don't really use it. Yeah.
Yeah. It's funny. A year goes by, and all of a sudden, Twitter isn't really as common a thing. It's still
at least in our
thing,
communities, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's definitely holdouts in certain communities where you can see people with, a big enough reason, or just not really worried about changing. And no judgment if you are on Twitter. We're not trying to say that, but just, it's funny. Interesting watching people who move, who don't, who try to straddle both worlds, all that kind of stuff. We're all in, so who knows? And then you can find 25 cents, of course, wherever you listen to podcasts. And there is the Good Stuff Patreon. Goodstuff.network is the podcast network we're a part of. Patreon.com/goodstuff is where you can find out more about how to support the network if you're interested. And I guess we'll see you next time we record, whenever we have a reason to record. Thanks, Nick.
Yeah, some after some VR fun thing maybe, or who knows what.
You can, if you can borrow a Quest somehow, we could record the episode in VR, I guess, maybe is the next stage of the evolution of the podcast. But
I bet one of my coworkers has one. I could ask around.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, everyone. See you later.
Bye, Chris.